Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first session of the Aspen Global Congress on Scientific Thinking and Action. Thank you to everyone who joined us a few hours ago for our opening keynote. And we're excited to dive in with our sessions. Natalia, do you want to offer a couple opening remarks before I introduce our chair?
Yes, of course. Thank you all for joining. I see a lot of familiar names on the chat, and thank you so much for coming on board with us to discuss this important topic, which is science denialism, so essential today during the pandemic. So, Aaron, if you can just introduce our chair and we'll get going.
I will. And just as a reminder, this is the public panel session, and to our Congress participants, at the end of this meeting, you're going to be logging in with a different link for our breakout discussions. But we're thrilled that even though we couldn't do this in person, the digital format has allowed us to make this event available to the public. It will be recorded and available within a day, and we'll be sending out the link to everyone who's registered so you can share this with your networks. I'm thrilled now to introduce the chair of the session. The session's called Building a Dialogue on Evidence and Values, Overcoming Science Denialism. Abhilash Mishra is a scientist and entrepreneur whose work is situated at the intersection of science, technology, and social inequality. Abhilash is the founding director of the SHU Initiative on Science, Technology, and Public Policy at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. He is also the founder of Equitech Futures, which is a talent incubator and research lab for inclusive innovation.
Thank you for the introduction, Aaron. I first want to begin by congratulating Aaron and Natalia for putting together this phenomenal event. And I'm thrilled to be chairing this session to overcoming science denialism, building a dialogue on evidence and values. That science denialism poses a serious threat to not only advancing scientific progress, but also to the public good is now widely accepted. What we can do to combat science denialism around the world, however, remains an open and difficult question. Part of the challenge lies in the fact that understanding denialism requires multiple lenses through which we look at the intersections between science and society. These include, for example, understanding the cognitive biases that drive denialism. It involves understanding the sociology of science, who gets to be a producer of scientific knowledge and who gets to be a consumer. This is what makes this panel discussion particularly unique, because we will have an opportunity to hear from science advocates and communicators from across the spectrum of the sciences and engineering, the humanities, and the social sciences. Before we proceed, I would like to share an anecdote from my work as a public policy researcher that made me appreciate the complexities around the acceptance or denial of scientific thinking and of scientific tools in the public sphere. In my work, I collaborate with governments and civic organizations to test the efficacy of policies using scientific tools like randomized trials. Few years ago, during a conversation with a senior policy official in India, the official commented, "Why do we need evidence? We know this policy does not work. It seems that you want the evidence to write your paper, but this does not really serve my constituents." As a scientist who cares about evidence, my initial reaction was great disappointment, of course. I remember thinking, if only we could understand how much this randomized trial can improve the implementation of the policy, the world would be so much better. In retrospect, I was, of course, very naive in thinking that scientific evidence is all that matters for a policymaker. And it took me many years to acknowledge my blind spot that I might value scientific evidence in very different ways than a policymaker or indeed a citizen. In fact, scientific evidence might come laden with values that we as scientists just don't consider as a part of our day-to-day professional activities. I tell the story to highlight that if we are to truly develop effective strategies to combat science denialism, it is on us as scientists, science advocates, and science communicators to develop a radical empathy for those who we wish to serve, to understand where they come from, what their problems are, And I hope today's discussion highlights that spirit, to be curious, to dismantle our own assumptions, and possibly come up with new ideas. In the words of the American author Brené Brown, we are not here to be right, we are here to get it right. With that, it is my great honor to introduce our distinguished panelists. I will keep the introduction short, but I hope you go to the conference page and read about their work and their journeys. Our panelists today are Dr. Joy Zhang, who's a Chinese-born British sociologist who is currently a reader in sociology at the University of Kent in the UK. Amardeo Sarma, who's an engineer and currently the general manager of NEC laboratories in Europe. He's also the chair of the Society for Scientific Investigation of Pseudosciences in Germany. Dr. Philipp Schmid, who is a behavioral scientist at the University of Erfurt in Germany, where he works at the intersection of science denialism and public health. And Dr. McIntyre, who's a philosopher and writer. Lee is a reader and a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science in Boston University and an instructor in ethics at the Harvard Extension School. With that, I would like to discuss how this discussion is going to go. So we're going to have we're going to have a panel where we ask questions to each other until we kind of complete the loop. And after the discussion, we will move into breakout rooms where each speaker will moderate a freewheeling discussion. And after the breakout rooms, we will reconvene again and summarize the discussion that we have in the breakout rooms. So without further ado, my first question is for Dr. Joy Zhang. The COVID-19 crisis has highlighted the lack of trust in global scientific institutions like the WHO, both in the West and in the East. This lack of trust often fuels science denialism. The reasons for the distrust in global scientific institutions, however, predate the pandemic and are quite different in the East versus the West. What, in your opinion, is driving this distrust, particularly in China and India, where you worked with? And what are some measures that global scientific institutions can take to rebuild this trust in a post-pandemic world?
Well, thanks, Chair. Thanks for that. I think it's a very timely question that all of us care about. And I also like to express my excitement to be with all of you today. It's a really great honor and great pleasure to share some of my thoughts on this. And I think actually it's a kind of an interesting question to kick off our panel discussion, because we're talking about China and India. That's quite different from a lot of the science denialism we're talking in the West. And I do think through my work that there's some very particular regional, historical, and social reasons for scientific either denialism or hesitancies or a kind of a skepticism towards scientific authorities. Because if you think about it, it's quite paradoxical picture. Because on the one hand, you have, at least the general impression is that you have a huge pro-science society out there in Asia. Of course, I'm not trying to homogenize the Asian experience, but given I only have 10 minutes, I have to generalize somewhat. And especially for those developmental states, it's publicly known that seeking technological fix is a shortcut to solve social problems. But on the other hand, at the social level, I'm not saying that the communities are not critical. In fact, given my work experience, I feel a lot of them are actually quite vocal and quite anxious, and actually they're very sensitive about what the technology is for and who develop it. So there are actually a lot of discussion going on at the social level as well. So I think if we want to get to the bottom of science skepticism in Asia, we really need to look at two different levels. And I'm going to use the example of the COVID vaccine. I know we're going to have a panel on Friday on this, but here's just a snapshot of what I learned. So at the state level, I want to highlight often ignored point, that is a leftist medical populism, well, we talk about medical populism a lot, but it's mostly the right-wing aspect of it, such as what we've seen in Brazil or under Donald Trump. But I want to highlight that at least in Asia, in China, India, there's a specific leftist medical populism that has a very strong counter-hegemonic element to it. That is, they pitted the health and welfare of the people against established epistemic or political hegemonies, and often foreign hegemonies, foreign powers. So in China, this is quite evident in the case of the overpoliticization of vaccines as a way for the state to curb the Western lead in the development in this area, as well as fighting for room for more global needs for Chinese vaccines. So earlier, we've seen that there's a orchestrated effort across Chinese state newspapers. That is, they openly question the evidence of Pfizer vaccine, and they actually question how Western media downplay some of the serious side effects of Pfizer. And they also call out to Australia to stop using this vaccine. Well, of course, this is very counterproductive because it directly feeds into the global anti-vaxxers movement, but also it actually does not help to promote public confidence either in China or outside of China towards China's own vaccine, because the varied clinical trial data from the of the Chinese vaccine was never really explained. And in India, although I know the story is slightly different because India's vaccine diplomacy has a much better global reception, you can still see a trace of these leftist medical populism in its rationale. That is, for India, is not so much pitching against Western hegemonies, but it's pitching against a regional hegemony, that is China. So a lot of India's early strategies evolved around how to curb the expansion of China's vaccine territories. And thus it actually becomes no surprising that when India proved the two emergency use of the first two vaccines, one is Covaxin, which was homegrown, home developed, despite the fact that at the time of the approval, it didn't have the clinical phase 3 data. And the other one they approved is the one that was mainly produced in India. That's the Oxford vaccine. Again, at the time of approval, it actually had incompleted immunogenetic data. But this kind of strategy, I know it kind of makes sense to India, is a regional development plan, but it does also have setbacks, especially when people notice that Sputnik 5 and Pfizer, both of these vaccines have higher efficacies and met otherwise all the rest of the criteria as the two approved vaccines. They did not get regulatory clearance. And that actually backfired on public confidence. And then we see that in India, a country which never really had a strong anti-vaxxer movement, we see this curious phenomena, whereas medical staff actually start to doubt or refuse to receive the vaccine at the beginning. I know things have been changing over the past 2 weeks, but this is how the leftist medical populism has led to. And actually, this also leads to my second point. That is, if we move away from a focus on the Asian state, and if we move into looking into the society, we'll actually see what I call a kind of paradoxical resistance. That is, on the one hand, again, you see a very pro-science, very pro-vaccine society. I remember reading last year in a survey published in Lancet, both India and China have as high as 91% of vaccine advocacies in terms of the COVID pandemic. And this actually echoes an earlier finding in 2018, when Wellcome Trust did a similar survey. It found that the kind of public attitude towards vaccines stays around high 50s in Europe. That's pro-vaccine rate. Is a little bit better in North America, about 70%. But if you move into Asia, is above 90, definitely. It's around 95%. But the curious thing is that all these extreme pro-vaccine public attitude does not automatically translate into coverage or inoculation. I've mentioned the India case that happened recently, but it's the same in China. Because as some of you may know, that actually China had a very early head start in the vaccination program. And in some of the Chinese cities, they roll out vaccination as early as last October. But to date, there are only 4% of the Chinese population that has been vaccinated against COVID. The uptake has been really, really slow. Of course, some of you may be saying, yeah, it's just because the pandemic is largely under control in China, and this is why there's a slow uptake. But let's not forget that since 2006, there has been a series of managerial and manufacturing mishaps, which actually dwindled the public confidence in vaccines. And in fact, the public skepticism towards vaccination in China has been so strong that it has prevented China from fulfilling its 2012 pledge of eradicating measles.
Wow.
And another example I want to quickly give is the case of the Philippines, because this kind of turnaround of public attitude towards vaccine can be seen in many Asian societies. And in the Philippines, again, in the early stage of the pandemic, the pro-vaccine rate is as high as 94%. But since March, when the Filipino government stated that only the Sinovac, the Chinese vaccine, will be provided to medical professionals, that led to the Philippines General Hospital's Physician Association release the fact that only 5% of the staff are willing to take the vaccine. So you got something down from 95% down to 5%. That's a huge drop. And I want to highlight these cases because I don't really think this is just simply a worry about made in China quality, but it also lies in the Philippines' public confidence towards its own domestic accountability, because all of us who work in the area would know that the Philippines' public attitude towards vaccine really dropped ever since 2017, the dengue fever vaccine scandal. So what I want to tell you about all these examples, I want to highlight the fact that in Asian societies, vaccine hesitancies or the kind of anti-science sentiment is not just reactive, is also conditional. We often talk about the conditional, how trust is conditional, but what we don't really discuss is how the kind of anti-science sentiment can also be conditional. So that leads to, I'm going to use the last minute to answer the chair's question. What can we do about it? I think there are two things. One is that we don't need to wait till the pandemic is over. We can do a lot of things in the interim. That is, we can limit the damage of the public confidence. Now we know where all these doubts come from and how people in these societies think. I think we can develop better way to think about who should we use to communicate scientific data and in what kind of process we use to communicate it. And one of the point I want to highlight is that the public in Asian societies may be seen as less vocal, but they're just as critical. And to some extent, they're perhaps more skeptical towards political neutrality. So if you ask me, I think our best bet would be diversifying the scientific profile or the scientist profiles when we communicate certain key data. For example, we cannot just rely on a single international authority such as WHO, but we need a more collective and more diversified participation from various civil organizations such as professional associations. They would be very powerful. And my last point is that the reason I want to highlight the leftist medical populism is just to highlight one aspect of how sometimes we may be talking about same thing, but it may blind us from seeing the actual regional diversities. Thus, moving forward in the post-COVID world, perhaps it's just highlight the importance of when we develop public engagement, we should develop in a more transnational cross-border right from the start.
Great, thank you so much. I really, really appreciated that answer. Now Dr. Zhang is going to ask our next speaker.
Yeah, and I have a question for Amardeo. Amardeo, I'm a great fan of your work on science skeptic movement. And I think the movement itself has been really successful in debunking lots of unscientific ideas, such as the belief in paranormal phenomena and fringe science. But sadly, especially in recent years, we're also seeing how the rhetoric of the skeptic movement has been misappropriated by some of the science deniers to sow doubt in scientific evidence in itself. So my question to you is, what do you see as the key challenge of some of these anti-science initiatives, such as anti-vaxxer movement or climate change denialism? What are the challenge of these initiatives posed for the skeptic movement? And where do you see the solution maybe? And how can we rebuild trust in expert and science in the future?
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm very excited to be here in this round of very interesting people, and the question is a very good one. And let me go back a bit to what skeptics have been doing over a pretty long time. And I've seen, in fact, there's Catherine de Jong as one of the people in the chat. And just to say that the skeptics movement goes back a very long time, more than 100 years, and initially very much towards pseudo-medical claims that have been set up. Now, from the history of the skeptics, we've been mainly looking at alternative pseudo-scientific propositions and hypotheses. And these have a lot of appeal because they sound very good and they provide magical cures or help people to get out of difficult problems, but they are usually wrong. And initially it was pretty easy because from a scientific point of view, you could try and show that these are wrong. You try to explain to people that they're wrong. But I think one of the points that Abhilash actually made at the beginning is a very good one. It's not just about being right. I remember the first president of our organization in Germany, Professor Irmgard Oepen, said it's just not enough to be right or wrong. The question is, does it benefit or does it harm patients from her point of view? You could expand this and say, okay, it's about consumers, about people. And the point that we try to focus on more and more is that if you deviate from science, then you're going to harm yourself because you make wrong decisions. Take the wrong therapy. You might harm your family members and so on. So it's in your own interest to move ahead with scientific facts. Now, as the time went on, we've been moving into other areas like also vaccination and even global warming and agriculture, where again we have the tendency where people follow very popular myths and don't realize that they harm themselves. And so, since about 20 years, I would say, many skeptical organizations have started saying, besides being critical towards pseudoscience, it's also important to defend science, because again, by using the right therapies and making the right choices, you're going to benefit yourself. And if you make the wrong ones, you're going to harm yourself. And one example, taking also the vaccination effort, is that there was a film that came out called Eingeimpft in Germany, which seemed very rational about how you make a choice whether you're going to vaccinate your children or not. And in the end, the lady does not vaccinate the child. Now, this was very made as a kind of pseudo-rational film. And the way we approached this is that the first thing we did was we got the eingeimpft.de URL and provided counter information to also, in a very reasonable way, not attacking the people, but trying to understand the worries that they have, but trying to explain that they're actually going to harm themselves if they follow these routes. So one of the things we have to realize, and that's maybe a kind of unique thing that skeptics have learned over the time, is that people are prone to deception and self-deception. very much. And so we've been looking at things like critical thinking to promote that as well. How can you identify myths and differentiate them from real science and real scientific explanations? So one of the problems now, going to the denier side, is that if you come from the skeptics, you are usually very critical about everything. Now you can start being also critical about scientific knowledge as well. And many of, as you pointed out, many of the deniers actually use some of these methods because they find some minor issues with some of the explanations, and then they try to find reasons why that's not true. And so I think the way we can approach that kind of thing again is to say, all right, are these people, do they have the answer and they're just looking for data to support what they're doing? Like they deny that there's global warming, or they deny that vaccination works, or are they asking open questions and trying to find the best evidence, and how is it compatible with existing knowledge? And very importantly, the whole thing is also, again, coming back to the question of benefit or harm to people, is that we must always bring this up again. It's not just about our being right and we are smarter than you are. It's not that at all. It's about what are the consequences if you're going to believe in something that is just not true. You're going to harm yourself in the long run. And there are some very good guidelines that have been developed over the years. And one of them, which I think is really an excellent piece of advice to anybody who works in a field like this, is Proper Skepticism by Ray Hyman. I can distribute the link later on. So it's very old. It's more than 30 years old, but it tells you should be prepared. You should be very kind to the people that you talk to. Prepare yourself. Don't go beyond your own knowledge and try to claim that you have knowledge in areas that you don't have. So there are many methods that can be used that you can gain the trust of the other side. I think this is the most important question here as well. That is not just right about having the right facts, but to gain the trust. You're not trying to harm them. You're not trying to take them anything away from them, but you're rather trying to give them knowledge that's going to help themselves make the right answers. And always leave it up to them to decide in the end. You're not going to impose anything on them. Make the right decision. We are just presenting the facts to you, and be aware that if you don't, if you make take the wrong science, or if you take the denialist point of view, you're going to harm yourself, you're going to harm society, your family and friends. So that's perhaps the advice that, from the skeptical point of view, and the knowledge that we've gained over the to some extent 100 years, can be used, and perhaps also used in the field of denialism as well.
Wow, thank you. That's actually really fascinating, and I think I've jotted down lots of very instrumental ideas here. Well, thank you. Now I'll let you to move on to the next question.
Right. So I'll be asking Philipp now. So maybe he's actually going to be presenting at the Skeptics Conference, if I'm right, later on this year. So. Yes. So my question to you is going to be, now you've done a lot of work about how to counter denialism, and also from my point of view, we didn't very much focus on facts and you telling people what's right, what's not correct. But very often the rejection does not come because people don't want to believe something. Very often they are very rational on some things, and they are not rational on others, because they have their own groups that they adhere to, they have their own people that they trust. So how do you see the balance here between getting the facts right and trying to get the facts across to the people who are listening to you, but also using the right messenger? Do we need to actually get people engaged? So if you're talking to evangelical Christians, for example, you need to have somebody from that group going to talk to them. Or if you're going to talk to somebody who is a more left-wing, you need to have somebody who looks more, with not so well-dressed maybe, and has a kind of a leftist look. And if you're going to talk to conservatives, then you would have somebody who's dressed up in a suit and things like that. And you wouldn't talk to somebody in a conservative area and send somebody from New York to talk to them if you're the United States. So where do you see the balance between how to get the message right, and how do you choose the right messengers to gain the trust of the people, to believe in the science side of it, and to get away from denialism?
Thank you so much, Amardeo. Yeah, let me go back actually to Aristotle with your question, because that reminds me of the communication triad that we always use when we think about communication situations. So we do have a messenger, we have a receiver of a message, and we have the message itself. And if we want to be impactful or effective with our communication style, we need first an effective message. And when we look at the literature about misinformation and trying to mitigate damages of science deniers, then there is advice out there on how to construe an effective message in such a situation. And actually today we heard something about it. It's called the fact sandwich, which is described in the debunking handbook that I will post online later on. And the fact sandwich states that if you want to get rid of a myth in the head of the people, you need to first write down the facts, then you need to warn about the misinformation, then you explain where the misinformation is coming from, and then you repeat the facts. And it can be shown that this kind of debunking process is the most impactful if you want to debunk false information. Another way of having an effective message is to uncover rhetorical techniques of science deniers. And science deniers, whether these are Holocaust deniers or climate change deniers or vaccine deniers, always use the same 5 techniques. They use fake experts. They say, for example, Doctor said vaccines are not safe. And Doctor is actually a Doctor in Germanistic and English language, so he has no clue about vaccination. They use logic fallacies, for example, argumentum ad hominem. They attack the messenger instead of the message by saying something like, well, but you are blue-eyed, I don't believe you. They use impossible expectation. For example, they state something like vaccines should be 100% safe. Well, no medical product is ever 100% safe. They use conspiracy theories and cherry picking. That means they pick data pieces out of meta-analysis, for example, and say, well, but there's this one study that actually supports my claim. So, and by uncovering these techniques, we can show in empirical laboratory work that the damage of science denialism can be mitigated. So the message here is go out there and uncover wherever you can, on social media or in face-to-face discussions. But that is just the message. And Amardeo was also saying, what about the messenger? And of course, there is research out there about source credibility that shows over and over again how important it is to have the right messenger. In the COVID-19 pandemic area, we need general practitioners because there is no other messenger like the general practitioner who is as impactful. So you could use a politician and say, well, let's vaccinate Biden in front of television, but then you only address Democrats and you will lose all the Republicans because they don't identify with Democratic politicians. But they do identify and they do trust their general practitioner. So on the local level, we do already have the right messenger. There's also evidence that shows that if you have a pharmaceutical industry who states something like vaccines are safe and there is no risk at all connected to them, then people actually decrease in their intention to get vaccinated because they smell that something's going on. A pharmaceutical industry is using a very pro statement. I don't believe that. So there are backfire effects if you have the wrong messenger. And then you have the audience. And it is crucial to know your audience and to understand which kind of speaker is adequate for the audience that I want to address. And of course, Amardeo was already saying that if you have a specific person and a specific audience and they don't match, well, then you can construe a message in the laboratory. It's not going to work at all. So for example, if you use a YouTube star, an influencer, and you try to increase vaccination uptake among elderly, well, that's not going to work. You need someone who actually speaks to the people, who identifies with those groups of people. And that is very crucial also for my minorities and ethnic minorities in Germany, but also around the globe. So you need to spot out and ask, who is the person that you trust the most? And we can only know that by asking. So what we need to do if we want to address a specific group with, for example, a vaccination campaign, is to design a questionnaire and ask people about the channels they use, about the people they believe in. And then we can identify them and use them for our core scientific evidence-based messages. But that is only if we see these three dots as not connected to each other at all. And that's not the case because they're intertwined. So if you want to become a trustworthy speaker, you should rely on credible and trustworthy messages. And you can become a trustworthy speaker by, for example, identifying what is wrong about the message of the other person. And the good thing about messaging and learning to construe good messages is, by doing that, you can also become and learn to be a good speaker. If we don't do that, and if we don't train people in designing good messages, then we can only rely on charisma of leaders and speakers. And that can actually backfire because we never know who is the next charismatic leader. We never know what's the next charismatic leader saying, and so on. And we can't really teach charisma. You can go to a person who's working on social media and say, well, just be charismatic. And they will say, well, that's weird advice, right? So what I need is some guidelines, some information of what can I say to become trustworthy. And then we are back to the message. And there we have actually very good psychological evidence on how to construe effective messaging.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's very good advice. And I'd like to just hand over to you for the next question. I think you'll be asking Lee, right?
Yes,
so,
that's correct.
Thanks very much.
Hi, Lee. Now it's the two of us. Yes. And the really tough questions.
Okay.
So my expertise is more on mass communication. I'm dealing with debunking on social media, dealing with inoculation interventions and public discussions. But what if my goal is to actually help the science denier, like protect the science denier from him or herself? Or as you frame it in a previous talk, let me just get that right, what to do about people who have been marinating in scientific misinformation for years?
Well, let me just first say what a pleasure it is to be speaking at this conference. And Philip, what an honor it is to be asked this question by you, because the study that you did with Cornelia Betsch a few years ago was really the landmark study that showed that it is possible to push back against science deniers. You provided the empirical evidence showing that this was something that we could all aspire to. And I joke with my friends that I could have read that study if my hair were on fire, because I've been studying science denial all these years, and here it was, technique rebuttal, content rebuttal. So bravo. But as you point out, there's an unanswered question in that, which is that if you're dealing with the audience for science denial, and especially if you're dealing with mass communication, what do you do about these people who are the hardest of hardcore deniers? How do you handle them? And here I started to look at the anecdotal literature. And the anecdotal literature shows that yes, you can convince hardcore science deniers, but of course it's impossible to convince anybody against their will. I mean, if you've got some cynical person who's maybe invented a whole disinformation campaign to convince an audience that some false thing is true, you're not going to be able to convince that, hardcore cynical science denier. I do think it's still important to go after that person though and to challenge them, because those sorts of folks can be the source of a lot of disinformation that, as you know, has a great influence on the audience for science denial. So just a few people spreading the disinformation can have a huge downstream influence on the audience. The way I think of it is, science denial, it's important to remember that science denial isn't a mistake, it's a lie. And there are some people out there who believe the lie, and you can debunk the lie for those people. But what are you going to do about the liars? Maybe you'll never be able to convince the liar, but I still think that it's important not to let them be the only ones with the microphone.
Thank you so much, Lee. I have a connected question to that. So I'm going to work with Sander van der Linden from the University of Cambridge and Stefan Lewandowski from Bristol on a research project. And we will try to actually help healthcare workers dealing with deniers in specific face-to-face situations when it comes down to vaccine misinformation. Like, what would you advise me what are like the 3 most important things that I need to know when I want to improve my way of approaching science deniers?
Okay, so that's a great question. And if you look to the empirical literature, I don't think there's an answer to this, because I don't think there have been a lot of studies of what to do face to face with the science denier, because it's easier to do the studies online or in other ways, and it's much harder to go out and see people face to face. I just wrote a book called How to Talk to a Science Denier, where after your study with Cornelia, I went out and I tried this. I tried technique rebuttal. I tried to do it, and it is very hard to do. Before I went out, I read some of the anecdotal literature, which shows, and this is something that I think Amardeo was saying before, that you can change people's minds based on trust, but not necessarily just with facts. You can't ram facts down somebody's throat. They have to trust you before they're going to change their mind. So the thing that you talked about, the project that you're doing with Horizon, I'm glad that you're doing that work face to face, because I think that that's how trust is best built. You trust people when you engage with them, when you see them face to face. And in the anecdotal literature that I read, virtually every person who was a science denier, who changed their mind on climate change, on vaccines, on anything, they all did it the same way. It was all the result of patience, respect, empathy, listening from somebody that took the time to speak to them and to earn their trust. Maybe it was somebody that they already trusted, but in some cases that person built the trust. Now, when I went out to try this, I chose the hardest of the hardcore. I went to the Flat Earth International Conference in Denver, Colorado in November 2018. There were 650 flat earthers and a little bit of media and me. And it's a challenge. Content rebuttal, not gonna work, because they know all of the physics from Aristarchus on up, and they're just not convinced because they're conspiracy theorists. Technique rebuttal, I had a little bit more luck with. I would ask them the Karl Popper's question. I would say, okay, you say that this is about evidence, not about faith. It's about evidence. So tell me what evidence, if I had it, would convince you that you were wrong. And they really couldn't answer that question, okay? And that was, at least got them to stop and think about it. Now, I didn't convert anybody. It's very, very hard to convince anybody face to face in a format like that with 649 of their peers standing around egging them on. So I didn't convince anybody face to face. But I do have a bit of advice for you, because if you're dealing with people who are vaccine hesitant, say not vaccine deniers, not the cynical people who are making up the propaganda, but the people who have heard it and you're trying to debunk it and you're doing it face to face, you'll have a better chance. And here, there is some empirical work which shows that graphs work. Graphs are more effective than words. So that's one thing that I would say. Nine and Riefler showed that. It's also important, consensus works, okay? Emphasizing scientific consensus, especially with conservative audiences, emphasizing that there is a scientific consensus, that works quite well. There's one other thing that I think is counterintuitive, but I think it actually, there's evidence that this works, which is admitting that some degree of scientific uncertainty, because I think that that builds trust. I think that if scientists can admit that they're not always certain of the result, which they're not, then that makes the audience more likely to trust them when they say that they're presenting something that they think they have higher confidence in. So what I really think we're suffering from with science denial is not an information deficit, it's a trust deficit. And the way to overcome trust is through this face-to-face conversation where you're showing the empathy and the respect. And it was too late to put in my book because I just read the thing on Monday, okay? On Monday, there was a story in the Washington Post about a political pollster named Frank Luntz, who's a famous pollster. And he's gotten a group together of COVID vaccine deniers. And he was trying to find a message that would work on them, that would convince them. And I don't want to say they were deniers, I'll say they were resistant, okay? But they were all, it was a focus group of people who were vaccine resistant. And what happened was I read the account in the Washington Post of what he did, and I've been hearing news accounts. He did it. He showed the listening, the patience, the respect. At the end of his focus group, 19 out of 20 of the people decided to get the COVID vaccine. So this absolutely works. And I hope that you're going to do another study. I hope you'll release the results soon of the Horizon 2020 study, because I've been anxious to see some sort of empirical work which shows that this technique actually works. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Lee. I have like 49 other questions, but we don't have the time.
We'll
so I will hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks very much. All right, so my question is for Abhilash. Abhilash, thank you so much for organizing this session. I really appreciate it. What a great opportunity. I wanted to ask you the following question. Science denial is in some ways the product of social inequality. There's evidence that more unequal societies have greater degrees of mistrust in science. And I wanted to ask you what you think is the origin of this kind of correlation, and what are some policies that we can implement to help improve trust in science, especially when social inequality continues to rise, not just in the United States, but around the world.
Well, first of all, Lee, thank you so much for that incredibly insightful discussion. I thought that was extremely useful, and thanks for your question. So I think there are two core issues when we talk about science denial and social inequality. One is the fact that the process of doing science and participating in scientific knowledge production, if you wish, has become concentrated with fewer and fewer people in the past 3 decades. And a second related consequence is that the values that are espoused and are centered by scientific experts in making big decisions seem to be a little disengaged from values that society at large might have. And sometimes it ends up discounting certain trade-offs that are necessary between values that society at large might have and the values that scientific might hold dear. So sort of going back to the first point of why science denialism exists because of the lack of participation. An interesting statistic to me has always been that if you think about the top 20 science universities in the US, where a lot of scientific research takes place, they are world leaders in science and technology research and development. Just about, if you look at the top 1% of the income distribution, there are more people from the top 1% of the income distribution in these top 20 universities than the bottom 50% of the income distribution. So that there's just like massive inequality that exists in these institutions themselves. And you can imagine that when scientific knowledge is being produced by a small group of the society, as you mentioned, there's going to be a natural trust deficit between the society at large versus the knowledge that is being produced. The other insight from the social sciences has been that in societies with large social inequality, there is just an inherent distrust in institutions. And I believe that distrust in institution is kind of embedded into science, because science then becomes a representation of institutions instead of a way of looking at the world. And so that is, again, one of the sort of core drivers, I think, behind why science is considered an elite enterprise, and the opposition against elites kind of gets clubbed with the opposition against science. And the other issue, I think, is around values that we as scientists, who are the producers of evidence, or the producers of scientific knowledge, we hold a certain set of values which might actually be in direct conflict with the values that the larger society might have. So an example is the whole discussion around lockdowns during the COVID-19 vaccine. So you had public health experts who said, spreading of the virus was needed to be stopped, and you had to have lockdowns. And there were large segments of the population for whom those lockdowns were very antithetical to the economic considerations that they wanted to have. And oftentimes it seemed, at least in the media, that those considerations and trade-offs of the economic considerations that people might have versus the public health considerations were not in enough of a negotiation with each other. It felt like public health consideration was taking a precedence over the economic consideration, which is not to say that lockdowns were not essential, but the perception that the values of public health officials is centered as opposed to values of other people creates an inherent distrust, and that distrust again fosters science denialism in the larger society. Going back to your second question about potential policies, it's fascinating that you cited the research around having direct conversations between scientists and the public. So Aaron Mertz and I recently wrote an editorial in Science magazine proposing an American Science Corps. And the proposal was essentially to have the Biden-Harris administration recruit scientists at early stages of their careers and place them in different parts of the country, predominantly in underserved communities and in rural areas, with a mission to build that trust in science from ground up. And then the goal is to be able to do that in a manner that actually involves citizens participating in scientific evidence generation instead of just public experts going and imposing evidence on people. So that's one of the strategies that I think could potentially help in increasing public trust in science, where it's important for experts to go engage with the public instead of just having the evidence either be communicated to public officials or be communicated from a point of authority. And the proposal was basically based on the Agricultural Extension Service, which has been extremely successful in the United States, which again sort of provided that two-way conversation between experts and farmers in the case of the Cooperative Agricultural Extension Service. But we wanted to kind of expand the vision of that model to include science more generally.
I love that idea. I read that editorial that you and Aaron wrote in Science magazine, and thought of the Peace Corps, thought of this goodwill and information. I could have used about 10 of those people with me at the Flat Earth Convention. It was, what a great idea you guys had. That's terrific.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I believe now we go to the next stage of the session where I'll let Aaron describe the next steps.
That's right. Thank you to our chair and the panelists for that very lively discussion. So this concludes the first public panel of the Global Science Congress. For the participants of the conference, we're now going to migrate to your other link for our breakout discussions. And for our public participants, I invite you to join us tomorrow. It's for our second session, and I'm getting the exact time zone here. It's called Science Literacy and Popularization, Understanding How Science Works. And it's on Thursday, March 18th at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. I hope you'll join us then with a different registration link. Natalia, anything else?
Jess, welcome everyone. Thank you everyone for a wonderful panel. And for those who are joining us for the breakout session, let's move on to the next part of our Congress. And for those who are joining us tomorrow, have a nice day. And we hope to see you tomorrow for the remaining of the Congress. Thank you.